So we are the Racial Justice Collaborative. I think we are ready to start.
Yes.
I'm here, Diane Wong, Frank Eason is over there in the corner. And I'm going to turn it over to Christina. We're happy to have Christina back. Christina.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. We're really happy to see you all here to talk about a topic near and dear to our hearts. I'm Christina Balch. I'm an artist and a cultural producer. I've been an RJC member almost since it was founded in 2020. It's a few months later.
Frank, can you spotlight her? Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm also on the board and the leadership team for a couple of years, and I'm joined with Dr. Chris Conz. We're here in the same house, historian, educator, humanist, not necessarily in that order. His historical research focuses on South Africa, Southern Africa, mainly Lesotho and South Africa. He also has a focus on environmental history and the way humans relate to land. Chris recently received a Fulbright Scholar Award for new research in South Africa during the 2024-25 academic year, which you might realize is happening right now. So Chris and I, we're married and we have a child, and we both went to South Africa on his Fulbright, all three of us, I should say. We just returned 2 weeks ago to our home in Western Massachusetts. So we just got back. We were there for 9 months. And we do have a kind of a relationship with the place. We met in 2008 in Lesotho, which is in Southern Africa, where we were Peace Corps volunteers. And we have good friends and host families there. And we cared deeply about Lesotho and South Africa. And that's part of the reason why we want to have this conversation at a time when US politicians are being openly hostile to South Africa and Lesotho. So that's what, we'll be talking about that today. And Chris will provide some historical context. While we were there, we mainly lived in a city called Bloemfontein, which is the main city in the Free State province of South Africa. Most of the people that live in that area are Sotho, which is the native Black African people there, and Afrikaners, which are the white former colonizers of Dutch descent. Obviously, there's more people than that, especially like at the University of the Free State where Chris was. But those are the main two groups there, groups of people. So it made for, just with all this news about the genocide, which we'll be talking, the genocide, which we'll be talking about, that Bloemfontein was kind of a good area to see what was actually happening there at the time. So that's it from me for now. We are going to have just a bit of presentation. Chris is going to give us some context, and then at the Racial Justice Collaborative, we like to have discussion. So we're actually going to open it up to discussion and questions and make it more of a group discussion and learn what you are interested in, and we can talk about those topics. So at least half of this time will be discussion with everybody. So video on is nice. Feel free to drop questions in the chat or save it for after Chris's presentation, and we'll open it up and everybody can talk.
Okay.
All right, it's all you.
Yeah, you don't want to start.
Oh, I forgot a whole part. Hold on. Thank you. I just wanted to lay the foundation for where we're at currently with South Africa and United States relations. So while we were in South Africa, thank you. While we were in South Africa for the last 9 months, starting in September, Trump was reelected in November and inaugurated in January. Trump signed 143 executive orders in his first 100 days. One of those executive orders almost completely dismantled U.S. aid, which meant millions of dollars going to healthcare and other initiatives in Southern Africa. As far as I know, it's disappeared, which has caused a lot of chaos and uncertainty in the world, but specifically we can say in Southern Africa. And one executive order targeted South Africa specifically, calling out a recent land reform law, and calling out South Africa's, quote, aggressive positions towards the United States and its allies, including accusing Israel, not Hamas, of genocide in the International Court of Justice. And then it goes on to say it is the policy of the United States that as long as South Africa continues these unjust and immoral practices that harm our nation, the United States shall not provide aid or assistance to South Africa, and the U.S. shall promote the resettlement of Afrikaner refugees escaping government-sponsored race-based discrimination, including racially discriminatory property confiscation. And Chris will talk about why that's a pretty outrageous statement. Trump also mocked Lesotho as a, quote, country nobody has ever heard of in a televised speech to Congress. And the day before we flew back to the US, Trump ambushed the president of South Africa by showing images and video backing Trump's claim of a white genocide against Afrikaners, which has been proven by almost everyone to be unfounded. So this US aggression towards South Africa is, for us, a salient example of white supremacist culture on a global scale. Claims of reverse racism against whites, particularly in recent, post-apartheid South Africa, are self-serving to whites and devoid of any grounding in historical fact. In South Africa, I don't think you'd either. We never heard one South African say there's a genocide happening. They have lots of other things to say, but I've never heard anybody use that word. Trump's insistence on a genocide of white Afrikaners in South Africa is unfounded, and clearly being used to further Trump's agenda, not to actually help anyone in South Africa. So that's the current state of things, and that's just that list of things that I just mentioned is why we want to talk about this today. So, all right, off to you, Chris Conz.
Thank you, Diane and Frank and others at the Racial Justice Collaborative, including Christina, for having me and allowing me to participate. And so there are a lot of approaches to this important issue. There's a lot of things we can talk about. And so what I'm going to do is, I am a historian, so I'll be talking about the past and how the past has contributed to this particular moment that Christina has outlined. I am going to do so through a couple of exhibits, including one very long timeline of the kind of broad sweep of South African history since European settlement there. We'll spend just a couple minutes browsing that, and then what I'm going to do is move into a couple of different slides, which I'll use to talk about a kind of historical trajectory since about 1948 that emphasizes what has happened with regard to land, right? This question about land, who owns it, who has been dispossessed from it, and the way that has gone really up until now. And so the timeline in these little exhibits, I'm just going to take, I think, about 15 minutes, maybe 12 minutes or so to talk about them. And if people have things that they want to ask questions about or to discuss or share their own knowledge, make a note of it. In my little spiel here, I won't get to even really a fraction of it. It's designed to provoke some further conversation. So first, the timeline that I threw together here with focus on land, issues of land, dispossession, and race over time. And so we'll just browse through it again, make a note if you want to ask about something later. Now, I realize there's a wide spread of knowledge. Some people probably know a lot about South African history, others maybe quite a bit less.
And I'll drop this in the chat so people can look at it on their own.
A little slower.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
if you want. You want to say what a Boer is, what that means?
No, I can ask that. So for our purposes, Boer and Afrikaner will be used interchangeably. In short, this is a group of people that are descended from Dutch settlers, but there's also been waves of immigration from France as early as the 1700s, and also German immigration that have kind of formed this group, also with African influences in intermarrying as well. They are not strictly descended from Dutch.
That's true. And they're not actually just white, like there's a lot of,
Right, we could talk about
Yeah.
that after too.
it's sort of bizarre that that white Afrikaners are being singled out. There's a lot in this timeline, but there's also probably a lot not in this timeline.
Of course.
But we're just trying to give a little overview. Here we are. To 2020.
You leave the last part just for a moment for people to.
Sure.
Oh, we can go to the slides. As I said, these are just a couple exhibits designed to give a little bit of background and you know, provoke some questions and comments. Okay,
Can you all see that okay?
The map, South Africa's provinces and homelands.
Oh wait, no,
people...
I'm not sharing that. Hold on.
We don't see anything yet.
Okay.
No, like, so I need to share a different document. Thanks. 1 second. Okay, how about now? You see a map? No?
Yes.
You
Okay,
see a map?
great.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So I could begin this brief commentary much further back than this, but I'm going to start right about when World War II ends, and I promise this will just be a few minutes. When World War II ends in South Africa and in the world, there is accelerated migration to cities, as there is in much of the world during this period. And it is a period where the Union of South Africa, which is a government, very much a white supremacist government, Africans cut out of electoral processes. There's a big election that comes in 1948. One of the parties in that election is the National Party. This is an Afrikaner ethnic nationalist party, and they campaign largely on a politics of fear, right? What they call the swart gevaar, the black danger. And all of the language around it is about Black migration to cities and how they're going to take over what they viewed as European spaces, right? That is the entire platform. And in 1948, a white electorate elects the Afrikaner, the NP, the National Party. National Party comes to power, and they begin the kind of formal apartheid years. Previous to that, there were a number of forms of segregation, but the apartheid begins in 1948. And the image that you see in front of you here is the kind of ultimate manifestation of the apartheid fantasy, if I can call it that, right? Where African people would live in specific homelands that would then become independent as independent states. For a variety of reasons, this is built on an entire fiction, right, of where people come from, how people are supposedly ethnically pure, right? It is all bogus, and I'm happy to talk at length about that if people are interested. Now, one of the goals of the apartheid state was to facilitate the flow of labor into European-owned industries, right, including industrial agriculture, including mining as well, right? Now, they created extensive legislation to do so, right? Dozens and dozens of apartheid-era laws, right, in order to do that. Now, To create these homelands that you see in front of you, sometimes called Bantustans, right, meant drawing borders and moving people around, right? Redrawing them. And there was an elaborate process behind this, right, that included government commissions. It included some debate within government. There were even some white farmers who were moved, who were compensated for their land and moved. But the real cost of creating these was moving entire Black communities around, right? Usually at very least coerced, at worst, completely forced to move. Now, what did this look like in practice, right? How to create these kinds of lands, right? By moving people around, redrawing borders. Next slide, please. And so along with the apartheid regime, they developed a highly sophisticated police state, right? Closely linked to government initiatives. Now, this image here, 1985, is of an evicted family in a place called Veenen in what is now KwaZulu-Natal, was then called Natal, right? You can see in the background there that government truck, not so affectionately known as a Gigi, a government vehicle, and then the white official in the foreground, children here with the furniture, right? A very striking image by William Matlala. Now, this image will let me to talk a little bit about some of the backstory, right? These people in this image, their parents, that is, were actually private land holders, right? They owned legal title to their land. Now, some of the people removed during this era, right, from about the late 1960s all the way into the 80s, right, about 3.5 million people all up, owned title to their land, right? Didn't matter. They were also moved, compensated little or nothing. Right? Many of the people moved of those 3.5 million were not title holders, right? That is, they lived in different arrangements on white-owned land. They were labor tenants and what you might in American history think of as sharecroppers and so on. But one of the things I want to get across with this slide is that rural social relations in South Africa have a kind of deep history, with people living on different properties. Some of them own them, some of them rent, some of them supply their labor in order to live there, right? And so over time, you have multiple generations of people living within communities, often with white landowners, and there's a complex set of labor relations that should be considered. Now, why say this? Well, because if we're going to think about murders in rural South Africa, we have to understand at least something of the social situation there, right? Far more complex than is made out to be by white nationalist politicians, both in South Africa and in the United States, right? If you multiply what you see here, right, and the man on the right here that we can just see in the image, not sure, but might be one of the white land owners, right? And so you have this kind of, like I said, a complicated relationship. Multiply it by thousands and thousands and thousands of times, and that's what the rural countryside of South Africa looks like. And so where did these people go once they were removed? Right, next slide, please. So in this image, we see a woman gathering firewood. People were moved to a variety of different types of places. This one was referred to as a closer settlement, which is essentially a resettlement camp, right? And this is in the 1980s as well. Some people showed up and lived in pre-built houses that you see in the background there. Often those were people that did have private title to land that they were removed from, so they were treated slightly better. Bit of a class difference here, right? The woman in the foreground, right, at least we can't see it, has no shelter, right? She may have had a tin shack that was pre-built for her. At least she had a toilet, right? So some of these landscapes of these closer settlements were put on very open farmland. And when people showed up, often they would see nothing other than hundreds of these pit latrines. Right. And as you can imagine, the conditions were very cold if it was in the winter, or very hot if it was in the summer. They were dirty, unhealthy, very, very poor sanitation, leading to a variety of health problems, right? Now, we as historians and as kind of global community members, we have loads of oral, documentary, and photographic evidence of this process over time. And so, final slide. Now, when the 1980s kind of came along, right, and this is the kind of height of the political struggle against apartheid, especially with Mandela being released from prison in 1991, and then the new government formed with the elections in 1994, the question of land after this deep injustice of dispossession loomed very large in the politics of a new South Africa. And so after all of this injustice, right, it remained an open question. What role would land and land reform play in a new South Africa for helping it realize its kind of dream of a new society, right? And so the woman you see here on the left, just a kind of snapshot, is a woman who was granted land and the right to return to where her family had been removed from during the days of removals, right? Elderly woman returning, walking in a graveyard, right? Reminding us of the kind of various kinds of ties that people have to land, right? It's not just about productivity. It's about home. It's about ancestors and so on. So, and so the, yep, there's an animation here, I think. Yeah. And so this is a key part, right, to understand. Now, some of the kind of advocates for giving Afrikaners refugee status, right, point to the fact that, well, most people around the world don't really know what happened in South African history after 1994, and I think they have a point there. But the reality is there has been a land reform program, and here's a sense of what it looks like. So first, there's a program of restitution. Now, restitution means when people can apply and their case be reviewed and then possibly be restored to land that their family was dispossessed from under racist legislation of apartheid, right? This comes right from language in the Constitution of South Africa that you see here, right, as the quote from 1913. People had the right who lost land after 1913, which is an important moment to apply for these restorative land, granting restitution to their lands that they once owned. Okay. Keep in mind, this left a lot of people out in the cold. If you didn't own land, if you were a labor tenant, or if you just did not have actual rights, legal rights to that land, you had no restitution claim, right? And this made up the majority of people displaced. Okay, next. There was also reforms. Now, this is an important point, right? Everything that came forth after 1994 was based on a willing buyer, willing seller model. That is to say, completely market-based, right? Completely market-based. Right. And so first among the reform programs, 1994 under the Nelson Mandela administration was something called the Settlement Land and Acquisition Grants, right? SLAG. Now, this was when a farmer or would-be farmer could apply to the government for a small grant, right, if they had been disadvantaged in the past, and theoretically purchase land that the government would arrange the deal, for the willing seller. Problem is the grants were way too small, and so often people pooled their resources together. The outcomes were varied. Some people got land, worked it cooperatively with other grantees, right? Other farms failed. Key point, it was a very moderate land program and entirely market-based. There was no expropriation of land, and in fact, the people that sold their land often sold it above market value. In other words, much of the wealth continued to be concentrated in white hands. Then there was a second form of this under the Thabo Mbeki administration, land reform for agricultural development, even more market-based, more commercially oriented, right? The benefits to the people who needed the land grants and land reform most were very, very few, right? So again, just to highlight this kind of fiction that somehow it's been a radical process of dispossession, right? Which is something that Afriforum, who I'm going to talk about in a moment, likes to amplify, right? That couldn't be further from the truth. There were people who wanted very radical reforms, including people from the Pan-Africanist Congress, right, which was another kind of spin-off of the ANC in earlier years. But in 1994, for better or worse, people might argue both ways, right? A much more moderate brand of how to go forward is what carried the day. Okay, next one. Winding down here now. So what about this idea of this narrative, and those of you that read some and followed the story at all, right? It's like this idea that there's somehow marauding masses of Black land-hungry people, right? And that white farmers minding their own business are being persecuted, right? Up to the point of genocide. And the argument is that the South African government has been cooperating. Now, that said, right, since 1994, crime is very real in South Africa, right, as it is elsewhere, maybe worse in South Africa than most places, and that includes murder, and it has included murder of some white farmers, right? Now, all murders are regrettable, as President Cyril Ramaphosa said in the the White House Oval Office, right? Now, to the extent that they have occurred, right, this has been completely distorted in the public realm and used as a kind of discourse to advance the project of a kind of white supremacist geopolitics, if I may say that. Data suggests that from 2020 to 2024, there were over 200 plus recorded murders on farms. This includes small kind of land holdings. It's a very large country, remember? And that more than 100 of these were actually Black farm workers, right? I think it was something like less than 40 were actually owners of the land, right? A violent problem, for sure, right? There are serious questions to be raised about any form of violence, but the shape of violence in South Africa on the day-to-day basis looks very different. And these account for a very tiny fraction of the violence that takes place in South Africa. Interest groups have raised questions about government kind of shortcomings, and they are right to do that, right? It is the duty of a citizen to do that, as well as the ineffective interrogations and investigations of South African police. But to say there's any kind of concerted effort based on an attempt to eliminate Afrikaner landholders is absurd. And I point you to the real violence in South Africa on the day-to-day basis, which is almost exclusively against Black people in particularly urban areas, but also in rural areas. Not only murder and violent crime, often gang-related, but also the day-to-day violence of the kind of geography that remains in the wake of apartheid. South African National Police, in fact, were called out to quell a 2012 strike, a minor strike, exclusively Black, and they responded eventually by shooting dead 34 Black mine worker strikers. So if there's a genocide against white people, that's an awfully strange way to implement it. Now, a final note, right? There has been a very contentious politics in South Africa, raising questions about service delivery such as water, electricity, healthcare services, and so on. And this, to some extent, right, is a healthy process. The ANC, the Liberation Party, has had grave shortcomings in their delivery of the quality of life that the Constitution has promised, right? In fact, there's been a spin-off, too, capitalizing on that in the form of a Black nationalist, communist-leaning party called the Economic Freedom Fighters. Some of you may have heard of that. They're very populist, they're very xenophobic in their rhetoric, and they are often fanning kind of flames of violent resentment. It's not to say that there isn't resentment about the shortcomings of the land reform programs that I outlined, right? And many of them are Black. And they have every right to be disappointed in this kind of outroll and the shortcomings of the promise of the Constitution, right? The EFF, however, is I think they have 39 seats in the Parliament of 400, right? And they are a ways behind. Now, a final group to mention is this AfriForum. AfriForum formed in 2008 or 2009. It is a group that is aimed at restoring Afrikaner interests. And they have bought into this narrative of a kind of white victimhood, right? The very roots of the National Party that won in 1948 was about how white people had been wronged and how they needed to restore what was rightfully theirs, with a particular bent on Afrikaner nationalism, which maybe we can talk about, right? Afriforum produced a film in 2019 called Disrupted Land that was full of inaccuracies and was nothing short of a kind of government propaganda campaign. It was this narrative that was picked up in the United States by Tucker Carlson and fanned into this, what you see as this executive order. Now, there are other elements to the executive order too, of course, the geopolitics of involving Israel and Elon Musk, if I might say that, right? But the idea of this kind of victimhood was a very convenient and attractive narrative to those interests. This Svartgevaar, right? The fear, the black danger was again alive and well as threaded with the film included a lot of communist language, right? Anti-communist language, like communist takeovers, and kind of preying on this same language that we're familiar with in the United States. They're tired themes, to be sure, but they're politically very powerful in South Africa, in the United States, and globally. And this is something that we might chat about. And so I just hope this is, to some extent, right, a kind of way we can use history and evidence and critical thought, right, for thinking about how we can engage in these terribly distorted political discourses and try and make sense of them and try and carry forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. All right, so that's Chris's presentation. If you want to take a deep breath, that's a lot of information, to say the least. But everyone just take a deep breath. And we'd love it if people want to turn on their cameras and ask some questions. I saw something in the chat, which we can start with. Diane asked a question. Diane, do you want to, I'm just going to read it out loud unless you want to ask it. Diane's asking, what constitutes the mineral and other wealth of South Africa? Who manages the wealth? Where does it go? What is the economic situation? What work do people have if not agricultural? It's actually like multiple questions in one, but why don't you start with the wealth of South Africa, mineral and other?
Yeah, I should say too, if there are people that want to weigh in on when a question is posed too, please put your hand up. I definitely don't feel the need. I mean, I have a lot to say about these questions, but I don't feel the need to be, to be the one to deliver, but please don't hesitate. Yeah, I mean, the kind of roots of in the 1860s and then 1890s, right? These are big times for diamonds first, and then gold being exploited on an industrial scale for the first time in South Africa. There are earlier diggings that happen, but they're often referred to as the mineral revolutions. Enormous amounts of wealth is compiled by, among others, British interests, Australian interests, Afrikaner interests. One of the key figures that I'm sure people know is Cecil Rhodes in these period, right? This is the root of the firm that we all know as De Beers Diamonds. Now, the wealth that's kind of compiled goes into kind of creating the modern South African state, but perhaps more than that, it transforms the entire region as whole migrant labor systems develop around this. And through that, some people would argue, I'm sympathetic to these arguments, the formation of the modern the modern South African racial order, right? With black laborers, white, higher paid jobs, and so on. Agriculture begins to get highly commercialized in the early 1900s. In 1910, the Union of South Africa forms after a very destructive war between British and Afrikaner settlers. And part of their compromise is to create this kind of white supremacist state, right? And one of their challenges is how to commercialize agriculture going forward, and also how to sustain the flow of labor to these very lucrative mines. And so they try and commercialize, they bring in machines, it starts to mechanize. And so these two kind of industries feed in. Some of the key questions around land are how to maintain the flow of labor to support these white-owned systems. And to Diane's last question, right, this is how wealth in South Africa was generated. Now, of course, it's gotten a whole lot more diverse through banking, other kinds of commerce, and so on. But even after 1994, the wealth in these industries is still largely concentrated in white hands, despite some efforts, including a Black economic empowerment program that has contributed to dispersing some of the wealth, right? There's a very large Black middle class in South Africa, often with links to the ruling party and so on. Yeah.
I do want to answer the economic situation question, though.
Sure.
The economic the wealth gap, the economic divide is stark. There's a lot of, it's like a lot of really wealthy people and or not a lot, I guess a few really wealthy people and a lot of really poor people. And also the unemployment rate is alarmingly high. It's like 40% or more if you're under 40 or something. I don't have the exact numbers, but it's extremely high. And youth, which is defined a little differently in South Africa, it's like anyone between 15 or 18 and like 30. It's so high, like people are just pretty hopeless about it. So even if you have a college education, it's still pretty high.
Christina, are you talking about Black people, or Black people and white people both have those same?
That's a good question. I think it's across the board, but
I mean, it is it's still largely divided by race. And so if you pass a South African town or city, right, let's say a smallish city, you'll notice a kind of concentrated area around a sort of city core. And then you'll always be able to look just beyond, or maybe you'll pass it in just a couple minutes, a very large township that is exclusively not non-white, right? The concentration of poverty in those areas is far greater than you can find in the cities. Somebody did ask, are there poor whites? Yes, absolutely, right? There always have been, and this was a key kind of plank in the Afrikaner nationalist platform, right? Because they felt like they were the gifted ones, right? The kind of God's chosen ones. This was, they had to find a way to remedy that, right? Class is very important in South Africa, right? Not as important as race, but there are very stark class divides, right? And so in a suburb in where we live, for example, where we lived, sure, there are Black families, right? Doing any number of things from teaching to, working, union labor jobs or, whatever. But it is, the racial divide is still very, very distinct. Right. And wealth is still very, very concentrated. You could drive for 5 hours across the countryside in any state, any province in South Africa, and be rest assured that almost none of the farms you are passing are owned by Blacks.
Do we have any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand or... Oh, Frank has a good question. Greg, I'm going to ask Frank's question, but then I'll get to yours, okay? Frank is asking, speaking of God, how does religion play into this? Yeah. That's a great question.
Yeah, again, if anyone wants to... Yeah, I mean, it's a familiar story that to those of you that are avid readers, students of American history, right? I mean, Afrikaners saw themselves as very much the chosen people. The Dutch Reformed Church was the kind of institution where this was formalized, and they felt it was their right and duty to settle much of the interior of South Africa, right? And this very much kind of galvanized a racial superiority. Again, this should sound very familiar to people who are familiar with American past, but I'll leave it there.
And I will say, a lot of people won't say that out loud, but you still get that. You still feel that in South Africa. When we were living in Bloemfontein, And we were gonna see if we could go see a game park like locally, you know, not going to Kruger, which is crazy expensive, but somewhere local. And when we looked up the few places that there were, they were, I think, all owned by whites, and all of their about pages on their website said that God had given them the land.
Right.
Like that it was like a gift from God for
Yep.
them. And I don't know the
Yep.
history beyond that, but you know, I think that says a lot. Greg, what was your question? I wanted to hear your thoughts.
I just wanted to make a brief comment about American involvement in South Africa in the late 60s and 70s. The Polaroid Corporation, based in Cambridge, was supplying the ID2 system, the film for the ID2 system, which was used for the passbooks to enforce apartheid.
Really?
And that was exposed by two black employees of the Polaroid Corporation back in, I think, 1970, Ken Williams and Caroline Hunter. They went on to found the Polaroid Revolutionary Workers Movement, and they began a worldwide boycott of Polaroid that went worldwide, and I believe they also testified at the United Nations about Polaroid's involvement in South Africa. And that there was a recent program about Ed Land on Channel 2 and an amazing guy he was, and they did a brief interview with Caroline Hunter there too. I just wanted to add that to the mix. Thank you.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. Maybe not a great story, but an interesting, interesting story.
Can I make a comment to Greg's?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you for that, sharing that, Greg. I would just, to add something, another thing that's quite troubling about the recent stance on South Africa is that, there has been a long, important set of relationships between the United States and South Africa, and they range from mining interests back in those mineral revolution days to perhaps more importantly for creating a more just society. The relationship of Black churches in the United States, including this dates back to about the 1880s, 1890s, right? Particularly the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where missionaries went over to South Africa and had a lot to do with the formation of early African nationalist parties, right? And this is something that endured all the way through. And then if we move into the 1960s, 70s, 80s, again, it's Black civil rights leaders, including people in Congress, right, that kind of pushed hard to have the U.S. engage with African nationalist leaders and to participate in things like boycotts, like Greg laid out. Remember that the U.S. administrations, with some difference, of course, were very hesitant, even outright hostile, including the Reagan administration, right? But it's troubling to see this kind of this amnesia, and then a willful amnesia at that, and a kind of backpedaling towards and saying that South Africa's constitution, right, is a kind of enemy of because it's too progressive, because it acknowledges the past, right, and because it seeks to redress that past. Nonetheless, right, the American ties are deep, and people in this group and in other groups, right, should kind of remember those and continue to build on them.
I'm going to send that out to people. What else are people thinking about? Lane, I see your hand is raised. Or it
Yeah,
says it's raised.
this is so important what the two of you were talking about. Thank you so much. I just want to mention that those stolen lands and dispossession was not just happening in the farm, as I'm sure you know, not just in farmlands, but also, in the cities and
Yeah.
Um, and my friend Yasmin Rubich, who's a Black South African woman, told me that her family was pushed out of Fietas in the 60s. And then District 6, also a lot of people were, and then Sophia Town was renamed Triumph, like Triumph for whom, and all of these people were just, these were all places, she told me, that people were living together mostly peacefully across color and defying apartheid segregation. And then like all these places were just like raised and then in order to create all white communities.
Yeah, thank you, Lane. Yeah, I mean the urban context, right? I cheated a little bit toward some of the stuff that I've been doing in my own research and to respond to the kind of farm question. But removals from urban areas, right? Very, very stark, profound, troubling. Bit of a common thread too, in one way to read language that we see coming out of administrations, right? And this goes for like different development projects and urban renewal projects in places like the United States, is the premise, right? Making the argument that, well, they had to remove those places because they were health hazards. Lane, right? Like Sophia Town in the Johannesburg area or District 6 in Cape Town, right? Or any other number of places. Cato Manor is outside of Durban. That was often the argument made. And in the rural areas, there was this subtext of an environmental language too, where the government would be like, well, you need to move off of that land too because you don't run it correctly, right? You don't make it productive. And here is what land should look like. And so there's this kind of subtext of what constitutes health and environment. It's not to say that urban areas don't have various health challenges, right? But often this pretext was used, and you still see it being used to move people around, not only in South Africa and the United States, but in other places of the world, right? And of course, threaded into that is this very often very racist language, right? About what is correct, what is best, what is right, and what is not right, right?
And she just told me, something really touching to me was like they said it was a slum, but it was our home.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and just the inflammatory language totally designed to divide people. People were living, different races and groups and heritages in their communities, and then the National Party. And this story is obviously across other cultures and countries too, like ours. But language designed to like tear people apart and separate and breed fear. And that was by design. But you bring up a really good point, Lane. Yeah, the cities were an interesting place during apartheid because a lot of cities were supposed to be white only, right? And Blacks were allowed to come into the cities to work, and that was it. So you had to have your passbook to be in the city. It's like, this sounds familiar, right? From other, like Nazi Germany, you had to have your papers to show that you were allowed to be there, even though you obviously weren't because of the color of your skin. So it's, yeah, I mean, there were different issues in different parts of South Africa, but it was, yeah, obviously, yeah, a different timing. Herb, I see you have a question. Do you want me to read it or do you want to ask?
I could ask. I just know that, throughout the world, traditional and indigenous people often have a very different view of land and ownership and things like that. And then when the European view of land ownership was imposed on them, they were at a big disadvantage about that. I just wonder what's true in South Africa related to that.
It's a great question, Herb, and it's a very big one. Struggle to give a yes, you're onto something, right? South African history to some extent is characterized by a conflict over the meanings of land, right? Private property, of course, was a new concept in Southern Africa, dating back into the 1600s. There are a variety of different ways of managing and thinking about land in the whole kind of spectrum of different groups in Southern Africa, right? And some groups had been in Southern Africa for thousands and thousands of years, some for just a few hundred. They came from different kinds of systems, right, through long patterns of migration in Southern Africa. But in short, I just, the one thing I guess I would make clear, right? Indigenous ways of thinking about land also change over time. And so one example of this in this story that I've tried to shed a little bit of light on, when many Black South Africans who had the means in 1913, they made a land act that prevented South African or Black South Africans from owning land in most of the region. And so there were some Black Africans, right, that were not necessarily big believers in private land ownership, right? They valued a kind of more communal and in sort of ways of managing land that were not about, this is mine, I can buy it and sell it as I see fit. But many of them sought to kind of play the game of the colonizer in order to be able to participate and to set up life for their descendants, right? Also very important when thinking about land, right? It's not just about me, it's about my ancestors, it's about the unborn. And so many of them bought private land. They got together and formed groups, right? Buying land in different areas. And these were targeted for removal in the 1960s and 70s. And many of these Black Africans were, of course, like, we tried to play this game, right? We bought legal title. Here it is, right? Here it is. And they were still dispossessed. And so it's really odd now that the conversation, right, is being said like, well, in modern South Africa, they're expropriating land without compensation, which they're not doing, right? But the whole idea of private property, right, has taken hold. Some people have adopted it and tried to use it for their advantage, often blending older beliefs about management, ways of thinking about land, burial sites, and so on, right? And so there's this fascinating kind of sets of fusions, right, of thinking about land. And at its best, it can really be amazing for innovative ways of thinking about land, right? Yeah, great question. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I also want to add that you mentioned to me at some point doing your research that there are certain young people in South Africa now young Black South Africans who are, through these programs or whatever, are entitled to land, but they don't want it. They don't want the land. They don't have a connection to it. They weren't born there, some do, but a lot don't. And so they wanted the compensation. They're like, we just want to get the money for it. And I don't know the breakdown of that, but I think that's, that sort of gives it some context too. It's like not everybody feels this deep connection to the land. Sometimes people don't feel the connection. They're, there's a lot of people living in the cities now. They like the city. They just want their apartment in Joburg. Yeah. It's just about time, and I want to be, I want to respect everybody's time. So I am going to hand it over to Frank to close us out. And I want to say I will be sending an email to everybody just with some of this information. If you're interested in looking at it later, please feel free to email us if you have any questions or if you want to hear about anything else. We'd be happy to answer over email and even maybe entertain another event if that's of interest. But I'll be sending more information. So please feel free to reach out if you have any more questions or comments or anything. Over to you, Frank.
All right. Thank you. And thank you everybody for coming. It was a really interesting topic and conversation that we had. And And like I said, some people know a lot, some people know a little. So I think having things like this in the dialogue just helps everybody. And I know, like we had mentioned, Carolyn Hunter, who, a lot of us in this room know, and you know from your childhood, and you go, oh my God, I didn't know that. So then you start looking up stuff. So I think having these conversations just really it makes it important to listen and learn, and we've got a personal computer in our pocket, and it's very easy to look up things. So just keep looking and keep asking those questions, and keep coming to events like these. So with that said, our next event is going to be June 21st. So this is going to be our Juneteenth event, and it's called The Cost of Forgetting: What America Loses When We Erase Black History. So I know normally Juneteenth is celebratory, and we want to be celebratory, but we can't always, because there's things that the climate in the United States and in the world, it just makes it so that you've got things to say in it. You can't just party all the time. So we're going to be talking about a little bit deeper. I mean, it's always going to be, there are a lot of things to be happy about and a lot of things to celebrate, but we should still kind of keep your eye on that prize, and not lose focus on what's going on around us. And as we all see, there's lots going on around us, and there are tons of things that are being removed. I mean, just today, Trump's talking about taking away, what is it, ending the civil rights desegregation laws in a lot of states so that they can segregate again, I guess, or just leaving it up to states' rights to do what you want. And so we just need to remain vigilant. So we're going to be talking about what we lose when we erase Black history, and how history is Black history. That you can't have one without the other. And I think a lot of times people will put that box around February and say, okay, well, here you guys have Black history. We'll make some ice cream and we'll celebrate things. And then the rest of the time, the other 11 months, forget about it. So just kind of keeping at the forefront that you can't have one without the other, because they're so intrinsically linked. So we will be talking about that June 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So if you have followed us on Instagram, on where are we? We're Eventbrite. You will have those pop-ups that come to you and say the next event is. So look out for that, and we hope to see you on the 21st. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.